Everyone. So I'm going to be talking to you about using a framework called React Native, together with JUCE. And I'm also going to talk about the reasons why you might want to do that, why you might want to combine these two frameworks. But before I get into that, I'm going to spend the next few minutes recapping on why. I did a talk last year at the JUCE Summit entitled Mobile Development with JUCE and Native APIs. So I'm going to quickly run over the whys because that really hasn't changed. And then I'm going to get into React Native, and then I'm going to finish up with a live demo. A little while ago, I had an idea for a mobile app, an audio-based mobile app. And I was looking around for frameworks, and I came across JUCE. And JUCE was a really good fit for a number of reasons, one of them being I can export projects and compile for Android, iOS, various desktop formats, plugins. So yeah, great. But once I'd got my audio processing code and my GUI graphic stuff working, when I started getting onto building the wider user interface around that, is when I started hitting some issues, especially on Android, but also a little bit on iOS. So the first one was with the JUCE listbox component. On Android, it's very jittery. And on iOS, it's also a bit jittery if you've got audio processing in the background, which I did in my app. And also, it's very difficult to differentiate between touch events and scroll. So as you're scrolling, you're kind of selecting things without meaning to. And what I really wanted was something like this. This is just some example Android code, and it's a bit smoother than this on an actual device, but yeah, it's pretty smooth. It's what people have come to expect using mobile devices. So after initially being dead set on writing the whole thing in JUCE, I took a step back and realized, okay, I'm going to have to rethink about how I'm doing this. So I knew what I wanted, and what I wanted was this kind of very common user interface pattern where you're scrolling a list of items, you click on one, you go into a detail page, you do some stuff, and then you go back. Very common pattern on mobile applications. So the solution that I came up with was to combine native development tools with JUCE. So what I mean by that is an iOS using Xcode and Objective-C or Swift to do my user interface, and similarly for Android using Java and Android Studio to do my main user interface stuff, meaning scrolling lists and navigation and data editing, things like this. So that was all well and good, and that's basically what I did my talk on last year, and I went into quite a lot of technical detail about how you could go about that. But I was left with a niggling feeling after that, which came up after doing the talk, which was like, okay, so I decided to use JUCE, which is cross-platform, but now I'm kind of splitting my code base in two. I'm going to have to write the same UI code for iOS and then again on Android. And this is kind of part of the thing I was trying to avoid by using JUCE. So this was on my mind for a little while, and then I was perusing the JUCE forum one day, and I saw a post about a framework called React Native. Now, my background is as a web developer, server-side web developer. I did a stint not too long ago as a Node.js developer, so my JavaScript chops are pretty good, I think. yeah, so React Native, the more I looked into it, the more I read about it, the more compelling it seemed, the more like it seemed this could be my solution. So React Native, just a quick sort of, what is React Native? It's a framework that allows you to build native applications using in JavaScript. It basically uses JavaScript to make calls to the native operating system. So you're basically getting a native application, but controlled by JavaScript. And React Native is probably running on one or more apps on your phone right now. It's a big part of Facebook. It's developed mainly by Facebook. It's also used in Instagram and Airbnb and probably a lot of other apps now. And it's gaining popularity very fast. So one of the big things about React Native, which is one of the things that drew me to it, is you can share the majority of your JavaScript code across iOS and Android. In my experience, I'm sharing, I think, close to 99% of my JavaScript code across the platforms. So this is starting to sound a bit like another framework we know about. So the combination of the two is starting to seem really compelling. So we can have our very efficient DSP processing, custom graphics code written in JUCE, and then we can have our cross-platform general user interface, navigation, lists, all that sort of stuff handled by React Native. Great. But hang on a minute, it's JavaScript. So yeah, JavaScript isn't my favorite language, but actually we now have, since a couple of years ago, there's some new standards in JavaScript called ECMAScript or ECMAScript 6 and 7, ES6 and ES7. Excuse me. And these make working with JavaScript a lot nicer than the JavaScript code that I would dread getting into as a web developer. So here's just a tiny example out of the demo I'm going to show you later. We have classes, we've got these 3-dot rest spread operators that are a bit like the variadic template stuff you get in C++. These cool arrow functions which just save you having to write the word function everywhere. So yeah, it's looking all right actually, and I've personally been enjoying using it actually. And there's a lot more stuff. There's loads of stuff coming into the standard which just makes working with JavaScript a lot nicer than it used to be. So apart from the language itself, what advantages do we get from using React Native? Well, one of the really big things is being able to reload our whole application without rebuilding, waiting for things to rebuild and reinstall onto your device. We can just reload our code, and the way it does that is basically when you're in development mode, it runs a JavaScript server on your computer, and then your device or emulator will pull that JavaScript code and run it. So one of the more recent things they've added into React Native is hot reloading, which is great because what it does is it watches all your files. As soon as you edit and save a file, it does a clever diffing algorithm and just does a little sneaky code change without your app realizing that it's changed, and keeps the state of your app. So you could be many pages deep into your application and it changes. So this enables really fast iterations, especially for tweaking user interfaces, much like you get from using the producer. Another advantage is being able to send JavaScript-only updates circumventing the Apple review process on iOS. So that could be good for some people. Another really big plus is access to the Node package manager, NPM, which has probably by now hundreds of thousands of JavaScript modules. And I did a search and counted more than 1,000 React Native modules. Many of those will include, or some of those will include native Java and Objective-C code. So basically there'll be JavaScript wrappers around actual native components for either platform or both. We also have we can use a JavaScript debugger. By default, that's Chrome, using the Chrome developer tools. And something that I've been using is state management libraries. The one I've been using is called MobX, and before that I was using Redux. These basically allow you to react to data changes in your application without kind of doing lots of checks. It just sort of does it magically. So that all sounds good, but there must be some negatives. So from my experience, one of the big pain points for me has been lots of configuration hiccups, and trying to get the two frameworks working together and being able to getting to the point where I can export my project from Producer and then just combine it with React Native has taken months basically. But I feel like I've done most of the legwork, so if anyone wants to try it out, you can have a look at my demo app and use my fork of JUCE, and you won't have too much to deal with, hopefully. Another thing is React Native has a massive open source developer community. There's often each release has had sometimes over 100 different developers contributing to it. So things move really fast. There's a new version being released, it seems, every 2 or 3 weeks. And sometimes there are breaking changes. So if you want to keep up with the latest React Native version, you might have to rewrite or refactor parts of your app. And if you depend on a library that's only compatible with one version, but you want to use a more recent feature, you can get into a bit of a dependency lock. But in my experience, I haven't had too many problems like that, but it's something to be aware of. Another thing is, before I was just using C++, and now I'm dealing with 4 programming languages. But here's a chart that I completely made up. So you're going to spend most of your time either in C++ land or JavaScript land, and your Objective-C or Java is basically boilerplate code just to send messages to and from. So yeah, you're not going to be spending too much time here, but you need to know those platforms a bit. You need to know your way around a little bit to be able to write the custom components in React Native, so you can bring your JUCE components and exchange data and all that sort of stuff. So next thing I'm going to be talking about is how you actually bring React Native into a JUCE project. So if you go onto the React Native documentation, what you'll see like there's a really quick way of starting a React Native app, which is fine if you're only using React Native. But if you're adding React Native to an existing project, which is the case with an exported Producer project, you need to use CocoaPods. So yeah, basically CocoaPods is a dependency management system for Objective-C code, and React Native kind of becomes a local CocoaPod. So the Objective-C side of your app will just reference that to bring in the React Native code. And that's also importantly how NPM modules that you install to use in your app will also use this method to bring their code in. And there's a little gotcha with that, which is, so you need a pod spec file in order to use a library as a CocoaPod, and most NPM modules that have Objective-C code don't come with a pod spec file. But luckily, I've written a little module that will just generate it for you based on the package JSON file. So onto Android. Similarly, we use Gradle to bring in dependencies. So it works in a very similar way. React Native is a local Gradle dependency, and it's brought into the Java side of your application. Now here's the pain point for me. If you want to use third-party NPM modules that have Java code in your app, they will generally they'll use the standard Gradle build file. Now, any of you who've done C++ and Android stuff or done JUCE and Android stuff, you'll know that the producer exports with the experimental Gradle format, which enables you to have code completion and stuff like that in C++ and Android Studio. So anyway, basically if you bring in third-party NPM modules, you have to hand translate the standard build Gradle format into the experimental Gradle format, and there's very sparse documentation on how to do that. And I've been told yesterday that they've pretty much deprecated experimental Gradle, so that's why there's not a lot of documentation. So I'm not sure where that leaves JUCE and producer and stuff. That's something for the JUCE guys to decide, I guess. So I'm quickly going to go over the general architecture of React Native. So basically, it's based on JavaScript core, which has been a part of iOS since iOS 7, I believe, and it's imported as a library on Android. It's very quick. So that's the bridge between your JavaScript code and your Java or Objective-C code. So bring in C++ into the mix, and you've got another bridge to cross. So here, on the iOS side, we have Objective-C++, which is great because we can just include our JUCE header in our Objective-C++ bridging file, which means we can also include our JUCE component header and reference any of our JUCE codes, so it actually makes the bridging really straightforward. But moving on to Android, and now we've got to use the cryptic puzzle, which is the Java native interface. Great. It's a real headache. But once you've done it a few times and you've got some bits of example code you can copy and paste, it's sort of, you get used to it, but it's not a lot of fun. But it's necessary. It's a necessary evil if you're gonna write like custom components with JUCE that you then bring in to an Android application, whether or not you're using React Native, even if you just want to have just use the standard Android tools. So that's pretty much wrapping up my quick run through of React Native and JUCE. I want to mention a library that I've been following and using in my React Native applications called React Native Navigation, maintained by a company called Wix, which is great. They're really active, and they're basically bringing fully native navigation to React Native apps, because the standard React Native navigation method is all written in JavaScript, and it just doesn't feel fully native, which for me was like, I want to make an app that looks like other apps, basically. So That's worth checking out. And now, fingers crossed, here's my live demo. Right. So I need to quit that. Okay. And okay. Cool. So here I have an iOS app and an Android app, and in the middle here is my JUCE component, and on the top this is the React Native navigation library, and I've got different sound. It's just basically a sample player, and just watch out because audio on the Android emulator. Oh no, I was hoping it wouldn't do that. Damn. Okay, audio on the Android emulator is not very good. Oh, hang on, I'm not getting. Don't think was I getting audio out of that? Oh dear. Okay. Anyway, so. Right, maybe I can do it like this. Sorry, guys. Okay. All right, maybe I won't touch the Android one too much. So I can bring up a list of samples, choose a different sound, and play it. For some reason, the Android one isn't going through, but yeah. So similarly, so this looks like a native iOS application almost, and I can go into. I can go into screens and go backwards, and it all looks like loads of other apps on your phone. Back on that. Have to keep flicking backwards and forwards. Okay, so the exciting thing I'm going to show you is the hot module reloading. So say, okay, I wanna change my layout here. I wanna play around. I just want to add some text that says something. So I save, and you see hot loading is going on. Boom, boom, boom. Hello world. And so I've added some text, and say I want to add some more text down the bottom, but it's gonna be really big. So I'm gonna style it to be really big. Font size 70, right, 80. Right, yeah. So it's hot loading again, and React Native has resized our component for us, so we don't have to worry about that. So in this way, you can see how you can really quickly iterate through a design. I've also, as you can see, there's some colors here. These are methods that I've had to implement in my component and kind of do the boilerplate to send the messages down. But this, say, for instance, could be used to have, you could have color schemes stored in JavaScript and send them to your JUCE component to change a color scheme in an app, for instance. So say I want to have my thumbnail foreground all white. Yeah, and then my background, I want to be black, say. So I do hot reloading, and it's sending a message, and boom. If I want, I can also change this, which is dynamically changing the sample name. I can just hard code that in, and it's going to reload and hopefully change the sound. And then I can put that back. And it goes back to the previous state. So that's kind of what I wanted to show you, and it worked, so that's cool.